Hello everyone. If you enjoy my channel, please support me with one like, one subscribe, and one share.
40 felt like the end. Have you ever looked in the mirror and wondered if life quietly closed a door without telling you? What if the greatest love story of your life wasn't waiting at 25 or 30, but at 40? When you had already convinced yourself it was too late. Stay with me until the end, because this isn't just a story about love. It's about second chances, quiet courage, family, everyday life in America, and the surprising truth that changed everything I believed about happiness. If you're learning English, simply relax, listen slowly, and let this story unfold one sentence at a time. The morning I turned 40, I smiled for every photo, thanked everyone for the birthday messages, blew out the candles, and even laughed at the jokes. From the outside, my life looked perfectly fine. I had a stable job, wonderful friends, a peaceful home, and a routine that made sense. But when everyone went home and the house became quiet, I sat alone with a cup of coffee and asked myself one question I had avoided for years. Had I already missed my chance to fall in love? That question echoed louder than the silence around me. It wasn't because I wanted a fairy tale. It was because I had slowly started believing that life had already made its final decision for me. Every year seemed to whisper the same message. You're getting older. You're running out of time. Stop expecting miracles. Social media certainly didn't help. Every scroll showed engagement photos, wedding anniversaries, happy couples traveling across America, and families smiling in matching sweaters during the holidays. I was genuinely happy for them, but deep inside, another voice quietly asked, why not me? Psychologists call this social comparison. When we constantly compare our lives with carefully edited moments from other people, our brains naturally exaggerate what we think we're missing. Ironically, many of those people are comparing themselves with someone else too. Knowing that fact should have comforted me. Somehow, it didn't. Instead, I convinced myself that perhaps love belonged to younger people. Perhaps life after 40 was supposed to be practical instead of exciting. So I stopped waiting. I buried myself in work. I volunteered on weekends. I visited local farmers markets, walked through beautiful neighborhood parks, read novels before bed, and told everyone, including myself, that I was perfectly happy. The strange thing about pretending you're fine is that eventually you almost believe it. Almost. Every now and then, something tiny would expose the truth. Watching an elderly couple laughing together at a grocery store. Seeing parents helping their children ride bicycles at the neighborhood park. Hearing someone say, "I'll see you at home." Those ordinary moments carried an unexpected weight because they reminded me of something I secretly wanted but rarely admitted aloud. Still, life continued exactly the same. Every Monday looked like the previous Monday. Every Friday arrived faster than I expected. Seasons changed outside my window, but inside my heart, nothing seemed to move. Then one rainy Saturday afternoon, everything changed because of a decision that almost never happened. I almost canceled my trip to a small community bookstore downtown. The weather was miserable. The roads were wet. I had already convinced myself that staying home with a blanket and a movie sounded much better. But something inside me whispered, "Go anyway." Looking back now, I sometimes wonder how differently my life would have unfolded if I had listened to the comfortable voice instead. Researchers often explain that unexpected opportunities frequently appear after small changes in routine because our brains become exposed to people, conversations, and experiences we would never encounter otherwise. At the time, I wasn't searching for science. I was simply trying to escape another lonely afternoon. The bookstore was warm, quiet, and smelled of fresh coffee and old paper. Soft jazz played through hidden speakers while people wandered slowly between shelves. I remember smiling because it felt peaceful, almost magical. I picked up a novel, found a comfortable chair near the window, and completely lost track of time. Then I heard a gentle voice behind me. "Excuse me. Is that book as good as everyone says?" It was such an ordinary question that most people would have forgotten it within minutes. I didn't. I looked up and saw a man smiling politely, holding another novel in his hand. There was nothing dramatic about the moment. No romantic music. No cinematic slow motion. Just two strangers standing in a quiet bookstore while rain tapped softly against the windows. Yet something about that conversation felt different from the very beginning. I had no idea that one simple question about a book would eventually lead me to question everything I believed about age, love, and the future. More importantly, I had no idea that the greatest chapter of my life wasn't behind me at all. It was quietly waiting to begin exactly when I thought the story was already over. I stopped chasing love. A funny thing happens when you stop searching for something with all your heart. Sometimes, that's exactly when life quietly places it in front of you. I didn't know that on the rainy afternoon I walked into a little bookstore. If someone had told me that a single conversation would completely rewrite the future I had already accepted, I would have smiled politely. And never believed them. The man standing beside me waited patiently while I looked at the novel in my hands. I laughed softly and admitted, "Honestly, I'm only halfway through it." He smiled. That's usually a good sign. People only read halfway when they're enjoying the story. It was such a simple comment, but it made me laugh in a way I hadn't laughed with a stranger in a very long time. We talked for only a few minutes. About books. About coffee. About how rainy weekends somehow made bookstores feel warmer than usual. Nothing about the conversation felt extraordinary. Yet something inside me noticed an unfamiliar feeling. I wasn't trying to impress him. I wasn't worried about saying exactly the right thing. I was simply myself. Looking back now, I think that's why I remembered him long after I left the bookstore. His name was Daniel. Before leaving, he pointed toward the small cafe attached to the bookstore and joked, "If this rain keeps us trapped here, I suppose we should at least have good coffee." Normally, I would have invented an excuse and hurried home. Years of protecting myself had turned caution into a habit. But something had already changed the moment I decided not to stay home that afternoon. "Why not?" I replied. 30 minutes later, we were sitting by a large window watching people hurry through the rain with colorful umbrellas. The conversation moved naturally from favorite novels to favorite places in America, childhood memories, family traditions, and surprisingly, our shared appreciation for quiet weekends. There was no awkward silence because neither of us seemed interested in pretending to be perfect. That alone felt refreshing. Modern relationship researchers often explain that lasting attraction grows less from trying to appear impressive and more from feeling emotionally safe. When people feel accepted instead of evaluated, conversations become more honest, curiosity increases, and genuine connection develops naturally. At the time, I knew nothing about those studies. I only knew that talking with Daniel felt unexpectedly easy. As the afternoon faded into evening, he asked if I came to the bookstore often. I laughed and admitted that I almost hadn't come at all. "Really?" he asked. "Then I'm very glad you changed your mind." It was a simple sentence, but for some reason it stayed with me all the way home. That night, I caught myself smiling while making dinner. It surprised me because nothing dramatic had happened. We hadn't exchanged life stories. We hadn't promised to meet again. We hadn't even discussed relationships. Yet the quiet heaviness that had followed me for years suddenly felt a little lighter. Over the next several weeks, life continued much as before, except for one unexpected difference. Every Saturday afternoon, I somehow found myself returning to the same bookstore. Sometimes Daniel was already there. Sometimes he arrived a little later carrying 2 cups of coffee, smiling as though we had known each other much longer than we actually had. We never rushed anything. We spoke about ordinary life in America, neighborhood festivals, local farmers markets, family recipes, hiking trails, movies, and occasionally practiced small pieces of English together just for fun. I realized that learning English didn't always have to happen in a classroom. Sometimes it happened naturally while laughing over the correct pronunciation of a difficult word or reading a funny sentence aloud from a novel. Those tiny moments quietly built my confidence without pressure. More importantly, they reminded me that communication is about connection, not perfection. Psychologists often describe this as reducing performance anxiety. When people stop focusing on avoiding mistakes, the brain becomes more relaxed, allowing language and emotions to flow much more naturally. Without realizing it, Daniel had created that kind of space for me. He never corrected me to prove he was smarter. He simply listened. Sometimes he even laughed at his own mistakes first, making it easier for me to laugh at mine. One chilly autumn afternoon, after we had spent hours wandering through the bookstore, he looked at me with a thoughtful expression and asked a question no one had ever asked before. "Can I tell you something?" I nodded. He smiled gently and said, "You always talk about taking care of everyone else. But who takes care of you?" I didn't answer immediately because I honestly didn't know. His question uncovered something I had carefully hidden beneath busy schedules, independence, and years of convincing myself that I needed no one. For the first time in a very long while, I wondered whether opening my heart again wasn't a sign of weakness after all. Maybe it was the bravest thing I could possibly do. I didn't know it yet, but that single question would become the beginning of the most unexpected chapter of my entire life. The stranger who truly saw me. Isn't it strange how one question can stay in your mind much longer than 100 compliments? I thought I had forgotten about Daniel's words, but they followed me everywhere. Who takes care of you? It sounded so simple, yet every time I heard that question in my head, suddenly, I wasn't so sure that was something to be proud of anymore. The following Saturday, I arrived at the bookstore a little earlier than usual. I told myself it was because I wanted more time to browse the new arrivals. Deep down, I knew I was hoping to see Daniel again. When he walked through the front door carrying his familiar dark blue jacket with tiny raindrops still resting on the shoulders, I caught myself smiling before we had even exchanged a single word. "You beat me this time," he joked. "I was starting to think this chair belonged to you." I laughed. "Maybe it does now." That small conversation felt surprisingly comfortable, almost as if we had known each other for years instead of only a few weekends. We ordered coffee and wandered slowly between the shelves until Daniel stopped in front of a collection of travel books. "Do you know what I like most about stories?" he asked. I shook my head. They remind us that people are usually fighting battles we can't see. I looked at him for a moment because those words sounded less like a comment about books and more like something he had personally experienced. Instead of asking questions, I simply listened. It turned out he had experienced disappointment too. His previous relationship had ended years earlier, not because there was no love, but because two people wanted completely different futures. He spoke about it without bitterness, without blaming anyone, and without pretending it hadn't hurt. That honesty surprised me. Most people try to impress others by talking about success. Daniel quietly earned my respect by talking about growth instead. Psychologists often describe vulnerability as one of the strongest foundations of emotional intimacy. When two people share authentic experiences instead of carefully protecting perfect images, the brain releases feelings of trust and emotional safety. Sitting across from him, I finally understood why I felt so relaxed whenever we talked. Neither of us was trying to perform. We were simply allowing ourselves to be real. Over the following weeks, Our conversations became part of my favorite routine. We explored small cafes, visited local weekend farmers markets, walked through colorful parks covered in golden autumn leaves, and occasionally attended free community events happening around town. Life in America suddenly looked different through those simple experiences. Instead of rushing everywhere, I started noticing little things I had ignored before. Neighbors greeting each other by name. Volunteers organizing food drives. Families gathering for outdoor concerts. Children laughing while chasing squirrels through the park. None of those moments were extraordinary on their own, yet together they created something beautiful. They reminded me that happiness is often hidden inside ordinary days. One afternoon, we joined a neighborhood charity event where volunteers packed food boxes for local families. I worried that my English might not be good enough to communicate with everyone, but Daniel quietly smiled and whispered, "Nobody here is grading your grammar. They're just happy you're here." That sentence completely changed my mindset. Throughout the afternoon, I spoke with people of different ages and backgrounds. Sometimes I searched for the right word. Sometimes I laughed at my mistakes. Nobody seemed to mind. In fact, every conversation became easier than the one before. Researchers studying language learning consistently find that meaningful conversations reduce speaking anxiety far more effectively than memorizing. Isolated vocabulary because positive emotional experiences strengthen both confidence and long-term memory. Without realizing it, I wasn't just improving my English. I was rebuilding my confidence. As the event ended, an elderly volunteer thanked us for helping. Before leaving, she looked at Daniel and then at me with a warm smile. "You too bring a peaceful energy wherever you go." I felt my cheeks turn slightly red. Daniel laughed softly, but didn't say anything. The drive home was unusually quiet. Not uncomfortable. Peaceful. Finally, he glanced at me and asked, "Can I be honest?" I nodded. He took a slow breath before speaking. "I haven't looked forward to spending time with someone like this in a very long time." My heart skipped a beat because I realized I felt exactly the same. Yet neither of us rushed to define what was happening. We simply allowed the connection to grow naturally, one conversation at a time. That evening, as I stood by my living room window watching the last autumn leaves drift across the street, I realized something astonishing. For the first time since turning 40, I had gone an entire day without thinking about my age. Instead, I had been thinking about tomorrow. And somehow, tomorrow finally felt exciting again. But life has an interesting way of testing the things we value most. Just as hope quietly returned to my heart, one unexpected misunderstanding threatened to convince me that perhaps I had opened my heart too soon. And losing it now would hurt far more than never loving at all. Love wasn't easy. The most dangerous moment in a new relationship is not the first argument. It's the first misunderstanding that neither person knows how to explain. Looking back, I realize our story could have ended before it truly began, not because we didn't care about each other, but because fear has a quiet way of speaking louder than love if you let it. Everything felt wonderfully simple until one Friday evening. Daniel and I had planned to meet at our favorite neighborhood cafe after work before walking through the annual holiday market downtown. I arrived a few minutes early, ordered 2 hot coffees, and watched people rushing along the sidewalk wrapped in heavy winter coats. 5 minutes passed, then 15, then 30. His phone went straight to voicemail. I looked out the window every few seconds, telling myself traffic in America could be unpredictable, especially on Friday evenings. After almost an hour, I quietly picked up my coat and walked home alone. The cold air felt much heavier than usual. My mind immediately began creating stories that had nothing to do with reality. Maybe he had changed his mind. Maybe he realized I wasn't the person he wanted. Maybe I had imagined our connection from the very beginning. Psychologists call this negative bias. When information is missing, our brains often fill the silence with the worst possible explanation because uncertainty feels emotionally uncomfortable. Unfortunately, the brain is usually far more creative with fear than with hope. By the time I reached home, I had already convinced myself that something was terribly wrong. The next morning I woke up expecting disappointment. Instead, I found several missed calls and one message that simply read, "Please let me explain." A few minutes later, my doorbell rang. Daniel stood outside looking exhausted, holding no flowers, no gifts, only an expression filled with genuine regret. Before I could speak, he quietly said, "My father collapsed yesterday afternoon. I rushed straight to the hospital and left my phone in the car. I kept thinking about you all night." The silence that followed felt almost embarrassing. All the painful stories I had invented disappeared within seconds. I suddenly realized how quickly fear had replaced trust. I invited him inside, and we sat quietly with warm tea between us. He told me his father was stable and recovering. Then he looked at me and admitted something unexpected. "I was afraid you wouldn't believe me." That sentence touched me more deeply than any apology could have. It reminded me that he carried fears too. We often imagine that only we feel vulnerable, while the person sitting across from us is somehow stronger. The truth is usually much kinder. Healthy relationships are built when two imperfect people stop pretending they are fearless. Relationship researchers consistently explain that successful couples are not those who avoid conflict, but those who repair misunderstandings quickly. Through honest communication and empathy. Listening to Daniel, I understood that trust is not built by never making mistakes. It is built by choosing honesty when mistakes happen. From that day forward, we made one simple promise. If something felt confusing or painful, we would ask questions before making assumptions. It sounded almost too simple to matter, yet that tiny agreement quietly transformed our relationship. Instead of allowing silence to create imaginary problems, we learned to replace guessing with conversations. A few weeks later, life tested us again in a completely different way. Daniel invited me to a family dinner at his sister's home. I was surprisingly nervous. Meeting someone's family always carries a quiet pressure, especially when you genuinely care about that person. His family welcomed me with warm smiles, homemade food, and endless conversations around a long dining table. What surprised me most was how naturally everyone included me, even when I searched for the right English words. If I paused, nobody interrupted. If I mispronounced something, nobody laughed. They simply listened. Educational researchers often emphasize that language confidence grows fastest inside emotionally supportive environments where mistakes are treated as part of learning instead of failure. That evening proved exactly that. I found myself speaking more English than I had ever spoken in a single night because I no longer felt afraid of sounding imperfect. On the drive home, I admitted how nervous I had been. Daniel smiled and said something I will never forget. The people who truly care about you are listening to your heart long before they notice your grammar. I looked out the window as Christmas lights reflected across quiet suburban streets, realizing that sentence described far more than language. It described love itself. Real love doesn't search for perfection. It searches for honesty, patience, and the courage to keep choosing each other after misunderstandings fade. That night, for the first time since we met, Daniel reached for my hand as we stood outside my front door. He didn't make a grand speech. He simply smiled and whispered, "I'm really glad we didn't let one difficult day become the end of our story." I smiled back because deep inside I knew something had changed forever. Our relationship had survived its first real test, but neither of us realized an even bigger chapter was quietly waiting ahead. Before spring arrived, One unexpected question would force us to decide whether this beautiful story was only a season or the beginning of an entirely new life together. Becoming a family. The question that changed my life forever wasn't, "Will you marry me?" It came much earlier, on an ordinary spring afternoon, and it sounded almost too simple to matter. Looking back, I believe that quiet question revealed more about our future than any engagement ring ever could. Sometimes love doesn't arrive with fireworks. Sometimes it arrives with groceries, laughter in the kitchen, and someone asking if you'd like to build an ordinary life together. Spring slowly replaced the cold winter across our neighborhood, and with every passing week, Daniel and I became a more natural part of each other's daily lives. We still visited the little bookstore where we first met, but now our weekends included grocery shopping at the local farmer's market, walking along peaceful nature trails, cooking dinner together, and laughing over recipes that rarely looked like the pictures. It wasn't exciting in the way romantic movies often describe love.
It was quieter than that.
Strangely, it was also much happier. One Saturday morning, while we were choosing fresh vegetables at the market, Daniel suddenly picked up 2 coffee mugs from a small handmade craft booth. One was deep blue. The other was soft white. He smiled and asked, "If we ever shared one kitchen, which one would you choose?" I laughed because it sounded like an innocent question. Then I realized he wasn't joking. My heart skipped a beat. I answered without thinking, "The blue one. You always drink coffee faster than I do anyway." Instead of continuing the conversation, he simply smiled as if he had quietly received the answer he had been hoping for. Relationship experts often explain that healthy couples usually imagine everyday routines together long before discussing marriage itself. Dreams are often revealed through ordinary conversations rather than dramatic declarations. Looking back, I finally understood what that little question had really meant. A few weeks later, Daniel invited me to spend Sunday with his family for a backyard barbecue. The weather was warm, children played soccer across the lawn, neighbors stopped by to say hello, and everyone seemed to know everyone else's name. What impressed me most wasn't the food or the beautiful weather. It was the feeling of community. People brought homemade desserts to share without being asked. Someone noticed an elderly neighbor carrying heavy bags and immediately offered help. Teenagers voluntarily cleaned the tables before the adults even mentioned it. Those small acts reminded me that strong communities are built through countless ordinary moments of kindness. Daniel quietly leaned toward me and whispered, "This is what I hope life always feels like." I looked around and realized I hoped for exactly the same thing. During the afternoon, his young niece ran over holding my hand and asked if I wanted to help decorate cupcakes. We spent nearly an hour laughing over colorful frosting while everyone else chatted nearby. Watching families enjoy such simple moments together made something inside me soften. For years I had convinced myself that happiness required extraordinary events. Yet here it was, quietly hiding inside paper plates, homemade lemonade, children's laughter, and conversations that didn't need to impress anyone. Positive psychology researchers often emphasize that people consistently underestimate the emotional value of ordinary shared experiences. Family dinners, neighborhood gatherings, weekend walks, and small traditions often contribute more to long-term happiness than expensive vacations or major achievements. Sitting in that backyard, I finally understood why. Later that evening, as Daniel drove me home through peaceful suburban streets lined with blooming trees, neither of us spoke for several minutes. Finally, he pulled into my driveway but didn't turn off the engine immediately. He looked at me with a calm expression I had never seen before. "Can I ask you something important?" he said quietly. My heart immediately began racing. I nodded. "When I imagine my future now," he continued, "you're already there. Not because I need someone to complete my life. Because you've made my life better exactly as it is. I don't want extraordinary days. I want ordinary days. With you. Tears filled my eyes before I even realized I was crying. No elaborate speech could have touched me more deeply than those honest words. They weren't about perfect romance. They were about choosing a life together, one ordinary day after another. I smiled through my tears and whispered, "I've been hoping you'd say that." A few weeks later, surrounded by close family and a handful of dear friends in a quiet botanical garden, Daniel asked me to marry him. There was no huge audience, no dramatic performance, and no expensive spectacle. Just two people who had stopped searching for perfection and found something much more valuable. I said yes, without hesitation. As everyone celebrated around us, I suddenly remembered my 40th birthday. The lonely evening when I believed love had already passed me by forever. If someone had shown me this exact moment back then, I never would have believed it. Yet life has an incredible habit of surprising those who refuse to completely close their hearts. Still, saying yes was only the beginning. Marriage would soon teach us that love is not proven during beautiful celebrations. It is revealed inside everyday life, where patience, forgiveness, laughter, family, and countless tiny choices quietly shape the future we build together. The life we created. People often think the happiest part of a love story is the wedding. I used to believe that too. But if you ask me today, I'll tell you something completely different. The wedding lasted one beautiful afternoon. Real love began the following Monday morning, when the alarm rang at 6:30, breakfast needed to be made, laundry was waiting, bills had to be paid. And two ordinary people had to decide whether they would continue choosing each other in the middle of everyday life. The first year of our marriage was nothing like the romantic movies I had watched for years. It was quieter, messier, and somehow much more beautiful. Daniel always woke up before I did. Every morning, I would smell fresh coffee before I even opened my eyes. Sometimes he burned the toast. Sometimes I accidentally added too much salt to dinner. We laughed more than we apologized because we quickly realized that perfection had never been the goal. Building a peaceful home was. One evening, after a long day at work, I came home feeling completely exhausted. The kitchen was still a mess from breakfast, the laundry basket looked impossible, and I honestly wanted to order takeout and forget about everything else. When I walked inside, I found Daniel standing in the kitchen wearing a funny apron covered with tiny cartoon vegetables. Music was playing softly while he stirred a pot of homemade soup. "Welcome home," he smiled. "Dinner is almost ready. Although I'm not making any promises." I laughed so hard that all the stress from work seemed to disappear before we even sat down to eat. Positive psychology researchers often explain that shared laughter reduces stress hormones and strengthens emotional bonds between couples. Looking back, I believe laughter became one of the strongest foundations of our marriage. We didn't laugh because life was perfect. We laughed because we refused to let small problems become big ones. Months later, our family grew even more joyful when we welcomed our first child. Nothing could have prepared me for how dramatically life would change. Suddenly, our peaceful evenings became sleepless nights. Quiet mornings turned into diaper changes, baby bottles, tiny socks disappearing inside the washing machine, and learning to celebrate sleeping for 4 uninterrupted hours as though we had won the lottery. Everyone told us parenting would be difficult.
They were absolutely right.
What nobody explained was that it would also fill our lives with a completely different kind of happiness. Watching our baby smile for the first time felt more exciting than any promotion I had ever received. Daniel surprised me every single day. He learned how to calm our baby during long nights by quietly walking around the living room while softly reading children's books aloud. Sometimes he laughed because the baby seemed more interested in hearing his voice than the actual story. Those simple evenings unexpectedly helped me too. Listening to slow, clear English spoken naturally inside our own home made language learning feel relaxing instead of stressful. I stopped worrying about perfect grammar and simply enjoyed the conversations happening around me. Educational researchers consistently find that language develops more naturally when learners experience repeated, emotionally positive exposure rather than constant correction. Without planning it, our home became the most comfortable English classroom I had ever known. As the years passed, our second child arrived, bringing twice the laughter, twice the noise, and somehow 4 times the laundry. Our weekends became filled with soccer games, school events, neighborhood picnics, library visits, and family bike rides through local parks. Life in America felt surprisingly centered around community. Parents volunteered at schools. Neighbors organized seasonal festivals. Families gathered for outdoor movie nights during the summer and holiday celebrations during the winter. Those traditions taught our children something more valuable than I realized at the time. Home wasn't simply the house where we lived. Home was the people who consistently showed kindness to one another. One afternoon, while walking home after a community picnic, my daughter slipped her small hand into mine and asked, "Mom, why does Dad always smile when we eat dinner together?" I looked across the sidewalk at Daniel carrying our picnic basket while our son happily ran ahead chasing butterflies. I smiled because the answer suddenly felt obvious. Because this is his favorite part of the day. That evening I asked Daniel if our daughter had been right. He looked around the dinner table, watching our children excitedly tell stories about school, and nodded without hesitation. "Nothing important happened today," he said softly. "And that's exactly why it's perfect." His words stayed with me long after everyone had gone to bed. Society often teaches us to chase extraordinary moments while quietly overlooking ordinary ones. Yet family researchers repeatedly find that children remember everyday routines, shared meals, bedtime stories, weekend traditions, and simple conversations, far longer than expensive gifts or spectacular vacations. Looking around our peaceful home that night, I realized we weren't building unforgettable memories through grand adventures. We were building them one ordinary evening at a time. Then, just when life felt wonderfully stable, an unexpected opportunity appeared that would challenge everything we believed about balancing family, work, and the future. It wasn't a crisis. It wasn't a tragedy. But the decision waiting for us would quietly test whether the life we had created together was truly as strong as we hoped it had become. Tiny English, big changes. What if I told you the biggest change in my life didn't begin with a wedding, a new house, or even becoming a mother? It began with a sentence so short that most people would never remember it. Ironically, that tiny sentence changed the way I spoke English, the way I saw myself, and even the way I connected with the people around me. Sometimes the smallest words carry the biggest transformations. One ordinary Tuesday morning, after dropping our children off at school, I stopped by a neighborhood coffee shop before heading home. The young barista smiled and asked, "How's your day going?" It was such a common American greeting that most people answered automatically. For years, I usually replied with one safe sentence, "I'm fine, thank you." Then I quickly walked away before making any mistakes. That morning felt different. Without planning it, I answered, "Actually, it's been busy, but it's a good kind of busy." The barista laughed and replied, "Those are usually the best days." Our conversation lasted less than 30 seconds, but I walked out smiling as though I had accomplished something much bigger. I realized I had memorized that sentence. I had simply spoken honestly. Daniel noticed the change almost immediately. That evening during dinner he smiled and asked, "You seem more confident lately. What happened?" I thought about it for a moment before answering. I stopped trying to sound perfect. He laughed because he already knew that answer before I did.
Exactly, he said.
People don't remember perfect conversations. They remember genuine ones. Those words stayed with me throughout the following weeks. Instead of avoiding conversations, I began welcoming them. I chatted with neighbors while watering flowers in the front yard. I asked simple questions at the local farmer's market. I thanked the librarian for recommending new novels. I even joined a small community book club where everyone spoke slowly enough that I could comfortably follow the discussion. Nobody expected flawless English. They simply appreciated participation. Educational psychologists often explain that language develops fastest when learners experience low anxiety and high emotional engagement. Scientists sometimes call this lowering the affective filter. In simple words, when fear becomes smaller, learning becomes bigger. Looking back, I finally understood why years of worrying had slowed my progress. My biggest obstacle had never been vocabulary. It had been self-doubt. Daniel continued encouraging me in quiet, thoughtful ways. Every evening after dinner, we spent 15 minutes reading together. Sometimes we chose short newspaper articles. Other nights, we read children's books with our kids, taking turns reading each page aloud. At first, I worried that reading simple books seemed childish. Daniel smiled and reminded me that every fluent reader once started with simple stories.
He was right.
Those peaceful evenings slowly improved not only my pronunciation, but also my confidence. More importantly, they created beautiful family memories. Our children loved correcting Dad whenever he made funny voices while reading animal characters. The house filled with laughter almost every night. Researchers studying family literacy consistently find that children who regularly hear books read aloud often develop stronger language skills, greater curiosity, and more positive emotional connections with learning. I realized those evenings were helping all of us, not just me. One Saturday, our neighborhood organized a spring festival in the local park. There were food trucks, live music, handmade crafts, children's games, and community volunteers everywhere. Daniel encouraged me to help at one of the information booths greeting visitors. My first reaction was immediate panic. What if someone asks me something complicated? I whispered. Daniel gently squeezed my hand. Then you'll smile, ask them to repeat it if necessary, and do your best. That's exactly what everyone else does too. I laughed because he was absolutely right. Throughout the afternoon, I welcomed dozens of visitors. Some conversations lasted only a few seconds. Others became surprisingly meaningful. An elderly woman shared stories about living in the neighborhood for more than 40 years. A young couple asked for directions to the music stage. A little boy proudly told me he had won 3 carnival games in a row. Every conversation reminded me that communication isn't about using impressive words. It's about making another person feel heard. Later that evening, while walking home beneath a colorful sunset, I admitted something that surprised even me. I think I'm finally enjoying English. Daniel smiled as though he had been waiting to hear those words all along. Because you're no longer studying a language, he replied. You're living it. That sentence completely changed my perspective. English was no longer another task on my to-do list. It had quietly become part of family dinners, neighborhood conversations, bedtime stories, community events, and everyday life. Looking back, I realized confidence had never arrived all at once. It grew one small conversation at a time, just like trust, love, and happiness. But life still had one final lesson waiting for me. A completely ordinary afternoon with my children would soon reveal a truth so simple and so powerful that it would finally answer the question I had. Carried since my 40th birthday, was love really something that had found me? Or had I finally become ready to recognize it? The day I stopped counting my age. The most surprising moment of my entire journey didn't happen on my wedding day. It didn't happen when our children were born. It happened on an ordinary afternoon when someone asked me a question so unexpected that I froze for several seconds before answering. That question made me realize I had quietly stopped measuring my life by my age and had started measuring it by my happiness instead. It was a bright Saturday in early autumn, one of those beautiful American weekends when families filled the parks with picnic blankets, bicycles, and the sound of children laughing across open fields. Daniel had packed sandwiches while our kids insisted on bringing far too many snacks. Convinced that every outdoor adventure required enough food for an entire neighborhood. As we settled beneath a large oak tree, I watched our children run toward the playground with complete confidence, making new friends within minutes. Children have a remarkable gift. They rarely ask how old someone is before deciding whether they're worth talking to. They simply begin playing. Sometimes I think adults spend far too much time counting years instead of creating memories. While the children played, Daniel and I volunteered at a small community booth helping organize activities for local families. Throughout the afternoon, we welcomed parents, answered simple questions, and chatted with neighbors. Near sunset, a cheerful woman around my age smiled warmly and asked how long Daniel and I had been married. After we talked for a few minutes, she laughed and said, "You two seem like you've been together forever." I smiled before answering. Actually, we found each other later than most people expect. Curious, she asked, "So, when did you meet?" I looked at Daniel, smiled, and replied proudly, "I was 40. For a brief moment, she stared at me in complete surprise. 40? She repeated. I honestly thought you'd been together since your 20s. We all laughed, but her reaction stayed with me long after the conversation ended. Only a few years earlier, I had believed turning 40 meant opportunities were disappearing. Now someone was looking at my life and assuming love had always been part of it. The difference wasn't my age. The difference was the peace people could now see in my face. Researchers studying emotional well-being have found that genuine happiness often changes not only our mindset, but also the way others perceive us. People naturally notice relaxed expressions, warm body language, frequent smiling, and calm confidence long before they learn someone's story. Looking back, I realized I wasn't glowing because life had become perfect. I was glowing because I had finally stopped fighting the timeline I thought I was supposed to follow. Later that afternoon, our daughter ran over holding a small drawing she had made at the children's activity table. It showed 4 smiling stick figures standing beneath a bright yellow sun. Above the picture, she had carefully written, "My favorite people." She handed it to me and asked, "Mom, do you like it?" Tears immediately filled my eyes. It wasn't because the drawing was perfect. It certainly wasn't. One person had purple hair, another somehow had 3 hands, and our family dog looked suspiciously like a tiny horse. But none of that mattered. What mattered was that our daughter had drawn happiness exactly the way she experienced it. Simple, safe, together. Family psychologists often explain that children remember emotional security far more than expensive possessions. They may forget which toys they received years ago, but they rarely forget the feeling of laughing together at dinner, reading bedtime stories, or spending ordinary afternoons at the park. That realization changed me deeply. I stopped wondering whether my life had started later than someone else's. Instead, I became grateful that it had unfolded exactly when I was ready to appreciate it. That evening, after the children had fallen asleep, Daniel and I sat quietly on our back porch watching the sky slowly darken. A cool breeze moved through the trees while distant laughter drifted across the neighborhood. Daniel looked at me and smiled. "You know what I noticed today?" he asked. I shook my head. Nobody talked about age. They talked about family,
Community.
memories. That's what people remember. His words felt strangely comforting because they reflected everything I had been feeling. We spend so much of life asking whether we're too young, too old, too early, or too late. Yet the moments that truly define us rarely care about calendars. They care about courage, about showing up, about saying yes when life quietly offers another chance. Positive psychology researchers often describe gratitude as one of the strongest predictors of long-term life satisfaction. Gratitude shifts our attention away from what arrived late and toward what finally arrived at exactly the right moment. Sitting beside Daniel, I realized gratitude had quietly replaced regret without me even noticing. I no longer counted birthdays with fear. I counted blessings. And somehow, that made every new year feel lighter than the one before. Still, one final conversation was waiting for me. A conversation that would force me to answer the question I had once been too afraid to face. Was it ever truly too late for love, or had I spent years believing a lie that countless other people still tell themselves every single day? Sometimes it is too late. Today, if you asked me the exact same question, I would smile before giving a completely different answer. The surprising part is that my life didn't change because time changed. My life changed because I finally changed the story I kept telling myself. And that might be the most important lesson hidden inside this entire journey. One quiet evening after dinner, while the children were upstairs finishing their homework, Daniel and I decided to take a slow walk around our neighborhood. The streets were peaceful, porch lights glowed warmly against the evening sky, and families were finishing their own dinners inside nearby homes. It was one of those ordinary American evenings that would probably never appear in a movie. Yet somehow it felt more meaningful than any dramatic scene Hollywood could create. As we walked past the small bookstore where our story had quietly begun years earlier, Daniel stopped for a moment and smiled. "Do you ever think about that rainy afternoon?" he asked. I laughed softly. "More often than you probably realize." He looked at the bookstore window before saying something that completely surprised me. "You know, I almost didn't come that day either." I turned toward him in disbelief. "Really?" He nodded. "I had worked a long week. The weather's terrible. I almost stayed home and watched a baseball game instead." We both stood there laughing because the thought felt almost unbelievable. Two completely ordinary decisions had quietly changed the direction of two completely ordinary lives. Researchers who study decision-making often explain that our lives are shaped far more by small repeated choices than by rare dramatic moments. We imagine life-changing events arriving with loud announcements, but many of them begin with something as simple as deciding to leave the house on a rainy afternoon. As we continued walking, I realized how often I had mistaken comfort for safety. Staying home had always felt easier. Avoiding disappointment had always seemed wiser. But avoiding possibility also meant avoiding joy. That realization stayed with me long after our walk ended. A few days later, while volunteering at our local community center, I met a woman who looked strangely familiar. After talking for several minutes, she smiled shyly and admitted she recognized me from one of the neighborhood book club meetings months earlier. She quietly confessed something that caught me completely off guard. "Can I ask you something personal?" she said. I nodded. "You always seem so happy with your family. Were you always this confident?" I couldn't help smiling because if she had met me a few years earlier, she would have seen a completely different woman. I told her the truth. I told her about my lonely 40th birthday, about believing love had already passed me by, about the bookstore, the conversations, the misunderstandings, the marriage, the children, and the countless ordinary days that slowly built an extraordinary life. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, Tears filled her eyes. "I'm 39, she whispered. "I've been telling myself that maybe I've already missed my chance." Her words sounded painfully familiar because they were almost identical to the ones I had once repeated inside my own mind. Instead of giving advice, I simply smiled and said, "I used to believe that too." Sometimes hope doesn't arrive through complicated speeches. Sometimes it arrives when someone quietly proves that a different ending is possible. Positive psychology researchers often describe hope as something contagious. When people witness someone else's authentic transformation, their own belief in future possibilities naturally increases. Looking back, I realized my story had never been only about me. It had become a reminder that countless people are fighting invisible battles against invisible deadlines created by fear instead of reality. That evening, after our children had gone to sleep, I found the old birthday card I had written to myself on my 40th birthday. Inside it, I had written one heartbreaking sentence. "Maybe this is enough." I read those words several times before quietly closing the card. I no longer felt sadness when I looked at it. I felt compassion for the woman who had written it. She wasn't weak. She was simply tired of hoping. I placed the card back inside the drawer, smiled, and walked into the living room where Daniel was reading while our dog slept peacefully at his feet. He looked up and asked, "Everything okay?" I nodded. Better than okay. Because for the first time, I truly understood the answer to the question that had haunted me for years. Love had not arrived late. Happiness had not forgotten my address. Life had simply been preparing me for a chapter one could never have appreciated if it had arrived any earlier. And as beautiful as that realization was, one final lesson still remained, a lesson that would completely redefine what finding love at 40 had actually meant. Love found me at 40. If you've listened to my story from the beginning, you probably think this ending is about finding the right person. It isn't. That's only part of the truth. The real ending is much quieter and much more powerful. The greatest miracle wasn't that love found me at 40. The greatest miracle was that I finally stopped believing I was too late for my own life. And once that happened, everything else slowly began to fall into place. A few evenings ago, after another perfectly ordinary day, our family gathered around the dinner table just as we had done hundreds of times before. Daniel served his homemade pasta. Our son proudly announced that he had scored a goal during soccer practice. And our daughter spent 5 full minutes explaining why our dog clearly believed he was the most important member of the family. We laughed until tears filled our eyes. At one point, I quietly looked around the table without saying a word. Nobody noticed because everyone was busy talking over one another, exactly the way happy families often do. That was the moment I realized something extraordinary. Years ago, I had dreamed about dramatic happiness. Instead, life had given me peaceful happiness. And honestly, peaceful happiness was even better. After dinner, while we washed the dishes together, Daniel smiled and asked, "What are you thinking about?" I looked at him and answered honestly, "I'm thinking about the woman I used to be." He gently dried another plate before asking, "Would she recognize you now?" I smiled for a long moment before replying, "Maybe not. But I hope she'd be proud." Those words stayed with me long after the kitchen lights were turned off. Later that night, I found myself standing beside the living room window, looking out at our quiet neighborhood. The same kind of peaceful streets that once reminded me of loneliness now reminded me of gratitude. The same silence that had once felt empty now felt comforting because I knew the people I loved were sleeping safely inside our home. It wasn't the neighborhood that had changed. It was me. Researchers studying emotional resilience often explain that lasting happiness comes less from changing our circumstances and more from changing the meaning we give those circumstances. Looking back, I understood exactly what they meant. At 40, I believed I was running out of time. Today, I understand that I was simply arriving at the chapter where I finally knew how to appreciate love, family, friendship, and ordinary life. A few weeks later, I was invited to speak at a small community event about confidence and lifelong learning. I almost declined because public speaking had never been something I enjoyed. Then I remembered the rainy afternoon when I almost stayed home instead of visiting the bookstore. Once again, life quietly asked the same question: will fear make your decision, or will hope? This time, I chose hope without hesitation. Standing in front of that small audience, I shared the same story you've just heard. When I finished, the room remained silent for a few seconds. Then people began smiling. Some quietly wiped away tears. Afterward, a woman approached me holding my hand with both of hers. She smiled through watery eyes and whispered, "I'm 42. I thought my story was already over." I gently squeezed her hand and answered with the words I wish someone had told me years earlier. Your story isn't over. Maybe your best chapter hasn't even started yet. We both smiled because, somehow, we understood each other without needing to say anything more. As I drove home that evening beneath a sky filled with soft golden light, I realized that love has never followed a universal schedule. It doesn't care what birthday appears on your driver's license. It doesn't compare your timeline with someone else's. Real love arrives when two people are ready to build trust, kindness, patience, and ordinary happiness together. Sometimes that happens at 25. Sometimes at 40. Sometimes even later. There is no prize for arriving first. There is only gratitude for arriving. Today, our home is filled with simple routines that once felt impossible to imagine. Weekend breakfasts that last too long because everyone keeps talking. Family walks through neighborhood parks in every season. Library visits that still remind me of the bookstore where everything began. Evening conversations on the back porch while watching the sunset. Tiny English conversations that became natural simply because they were shared with people I loved. None of these moments would ever become breaking news. Yet together they created the richest life I could have asked for. So if you're listening today while wondering whether you've missed your chance, whether for love, friendship, confidence, learning English, or simply becoming the person you've always hoped to be, I hope my story stays with you long after this video ends. Don't let a calendar decide what your heart is allowed to hope for. Don't confuse waiting with failure. And never believe that an ordinary day cannot become the beginning of an extraordinary life. Sometimes all it takes is one small decision. To leave the house, to start one conversation, to learn one new sentence, or to believe in yourself one more time. That tiny decision might quietly change everything, just as it changed everything for me. That's all for today. I'll be creating many more stories like this in the future. Don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the next one.